Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of January 10th, 2021. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am pleased to offer you this philosophical conversation today among a distinguished panel of our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and our special guest, Dr. Max Moore. First, I will introduce our panelists. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our illustrious 2020 US presidential candidate and Director of Marketing, Charlie Kam. We have our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton. We have our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker. We have Alexandria Black, our Director of Community Resilience. We have our Secretary, Pavel Ilin. We have our Vice Chairman, Arin Vahanian. And we have Jose Cordero, who is our Technology Advisor and also our Foreign Ambassador in Spain. So welcome to all of our panelists, and our special guest, Dr. Max Moore, really does not need an introduction within the transhumanist movement because he is one of the foundational figures in the philosophy of transhumanism. The philosophy of transhumanism would not exist in its present form were it not for the writings of Max Moore going back to the 1980s and through the present day. Max Moore has also been the CEO of Alcor, and he is now the ambassador and president emeritus of this organization, the Alcor Life Extension Foundation, one of the leading cryonics organizations in the world. So today's conversation will be both philosophical and practical in nature. We're going to try to relate some of the key topics in the philosophy of transhumanism to some of the questions that are most relevant to those of us seeking to extend our lives, as well as solve difficult problems in today's world and today's political system. So welcome, Max. And as a beginning, I would ask you to give us a brief overview of the history of the philosophy of transhumanism and your contributions to it, and particularly your writings about extropianism, such as the principles of extropy and how they've contributed to the development of transhumanism over time.
Thank you, Gennady. Well, it's a pretty complex topic that I'll try to sort of touch on from my point of view. I know Natasha gave her perspective on that recently. From my point of view, really, I like to think about where did these ideas for me first come from? And I sometimes joke that it's almost like there's a gene for this because it's pretty hard to explain how I came to think this way from my background. Certainly none of my family or my friends or anybody else around me thought remotely this way. Obviously I read books and that had some influences, but it's almost like there's a gene for it that I happen to have. From a very early age, before I really understood science and technology, critical thinking, I always had a drive towards, I guess, what you could call transcendence, in the general sense of overcoming limitations. And I went through various stages of exploring that. Before I developed more critical thinking skills, I looked into all kinds of different belief systems, and I actually got quite into what you might call New Age, or sometimes called the occult, to see if that would do anything. You cannot overcome nature in some way. And in the end, I decided, nah, not really. It doesn't really work. It's all about fooling yourself. I did think I could bend spoons for a while until I realized that, I put it in a clam and it suddenly would no longer move. So clearly I was just not feeling the feedback. So that didn't really work. And then I got more interested. I read science fiction. I got more interested in science and technology. And just lost my train of thought, man. Thank you. So that all really had in common the idea of overcoming limits. As also I think a very strong aspect of that is space. The Apollo 11 moon landing was when I was 5 years old, and I was absolutely fascinated by that. I could not be pried away from the television. I stayed up every single one of the Apollo launches after that, when most people had gotten bored. As a kid, I drew these rocket boots trying to fly. I had stories about me building a rocket and flying to the moon and that kind of thing. I was very much wanted to be an astronaut. So that kind of is part of really the transhumanist impulse, I think. That's the part that says, why should we be confined to this one planet? Why are we stuck here? Why is that a limit that we should accept? at the same time, I was obviously interested in overcoming our intellectual limits, becoming smarter than we've ever been, and into life extension too. I started taking supplements when I was about 12 or 13, I think. And I got very much into supplements for a while, and then started exploring other aspects. And obviously so one of these is about overcoming spatial limitations. Another one is about overcoming temporal limitations. And then later on, you also added along with the intellectual stuff, I also added the emotional limitations. How can we transform ourselves emotionally? Because I think that's a very important aspect of transhumanism, which many of its critics just completely ignore. They say that we're just kind of uber nerds who just want to be smarter and have superpowers or something. They never mention the fact that, I've talked about this many times, as is Natasha. We evolved to have certain kinds of responses, fight reflexes, to have, to be protecting our group and to look suspiciously at other people. And so our brains basically became wired for us to survive under very simple circumstances. See saber-toothed tiger, feel fear, run. We did not develop these brains to really deal with complex societies and problems. And since we've only had, what we call civilization for not many thousands of years, certainly not long enough to really have our genes to have adapted to them, we're in kind of a mess. We're kind of cave people still trying to deal with the modern world. So I think a kind of emotional transcendence is also very important. So these ideas were, kind of bouncing around in my head from a really very early age. And I think, in my teens, I became very much very philosophical before I became, a real philosopher. I was quite philosophical and always looking for the interconnections among things and the big picture. And so even before I came to the States in '87, I actually started the first cryonics organization in England in 1986. We put out a newsletter that was kind of like a proto-extropy in a way. It was all about overcoming limitations, not just to do with life extension. So that was kind of the core of the idea of extropy. So, when my co-founder of Extropy Institute in the magazine, Tom Morrow, came up with that term extropy, he actually came up with the term. It was meant as a metaphorical opposite of entropy. It's not intended as, again, a kind of technical term. It's not like entropy. It's a bit more metaphorical, but really it's all the forces that lead to intelligence, creativity, more vitality, more life, all those good things. So that kind of pulled together all that stuff with space and life extension, intelligence, and emotional rationality, and so on. One of the first real influences, well, there are a few people, I guess, but one of the first publications I can remember that really seemed to, well, actually, there's a couple of them. There was a Future Life magazine. I don't know if any of you remember that. It was put out by the same people as Omni magazine. And they had Future Life and they had Starlog at the time. And Future Life had some pretty interesting stuff, interviews with Robert Anton Wilson and Tim Leary and a whole bunch of other people, which was kind of proto-extropy. And of course, Tim Leary himself, although he kind of went wild and woolly in his thinking in many ways, he had this very nice equation that I was rather fond of and still am, the SMILE formula, SMI²LE, space migration, intelligence increase, life extension. And that really is kind of the core of extropic thinking and of transhumanism in a way. The other magazine of the time I remember is called Claustrophobia. I don't know if any of you remember this one, but it was all about space, intelligence increase, and life extension. It was exactly those core themes. So when I came over to the States to do graduate work at USC, and I guess about a year after that, we started Extropy magazine in 1988, which we just, it was like 40 or 50 copies we printed, managed to get it reviewed in some underground publications like Fact Sheet 5, some of you might remember that gold mine. And I would get letters from people, in the middle of the country, people who had no one else to talk to, who thought that they must be really weird because they had these ideas, didn't think anybody else did. And they were so excited that they found Extropy magazine and there were other people thinking these thoughts. So that's kind of how I got started. And then we built that up. I defined the principles of extropy. I wrote another kind of core piece. Actually, first of all, I think it appeared in the humanist publication, Free Inquiry, called On Becoming Posthuman. So that's quite a way back. And that was an interesting piece because it really divided the humanists into two quite radically separated groups. The response, I think it was Tim Evans as the editor, he said that it got more response than anything they published, and half of them loved it and half of them hated it. So the ones who were real humanists were focusing on staying human, and being human is what gives us life, gives our life meaning. And so they didn't like this idea of trying to blow up the concept of human. But the other people were the ones actually, I think, more true to the humanist tradition, interested in real progress. And that's what transhumanism is about. It's about progress in a really fundamental way, progress with the human condition. So that really led to the principles of extropy, which went through several rounds of development. That was the, I guess people's favorite version is 2.5. It has the nice, neat acronym Best Do It So, which stood for boundless expansion, self-transformation, dynamic optimism, intelligent technology, and spontaneous order. We started putting on the Extro conferences, I guess, in 1994. Those got covered by Wired magazine and put a lot of new people in. And what's interesting to me thinking back on that now is, in those early days, the difficult thing in talking to people or to journalists was in trying to get them to take us seriously. Oh, you think they're going to be intelligent machines and we'll be colonizing space and extending human lifespan? Yeah, right, sure. These days, that's not the problem anymore, right? Everybody's talking about AI. Everybody's talking about life extension. It's more a matter of, should we be worried about AI taking over? What about the inequities of life extension? So it's changed drastically in that time. So I think transhumanism in its various forms, even if it's not always called that, has really spread really enormously since then. I guess there's one other thing I'd like to mention before moving off this, which to me is a really important part of extropic thinking and hopefully transhumanism. That is critical rationalism. To me, really a central part of transhumanist thinking and humanist thinking before that is critical rationalism, the ability to question your most fundamental beliefs, a willingness to question them, because what you really want is not to be right or to prove yourself right, it's to progress. There's a big difference between being right and making progress. If you insist on being right, right in quotes, you're not going to make progress. I think it was maybe it was Rodin Wilson who said that convictions make us convicts. So you have to be careful about having too strong convictions. So I kind of, as I got more and more philosophical, I looked into critical rationalism and the kind of the hardcore version of that, pancritical rationalism, which basically says everything is up for question, including rationality itself. And it's kind of an outgrowth of Karl Popper's thinking. Popper, is well known for his idea that you can't really ever verify fully a scientific proposition. What you can do is keep using a scientific theory so long as it has survived attempts to refute it. And so long as you have really tested it and you keep testing it and it keeps beating those refutations, then you're justified in holding it. And so for the same reasons, you can't rationally justify the laws of logic, right? That would be circular. But you use them because they work, but you're always willing to listen to someone who thinks they can somehow show you a better way. So I think that kind of critical rationalism is ever more important today because we've become incredibly tribal in our thinking these days, divided into these warring cultural and political groups, all of whom are so certain that they're right about everything. I think the same thing with the COVID. People are so sure they know what's right. And in fact, it's very new and we really are still learning a lot. So if you could dial down the certainty and the dogma and become better critical rationalists, I think that would be very helpful.
Yes, thank you, Max, for that excellent overview. And I think this is valuable practical advice for these divisive and polarized times. Now, in the era we live in, where to some extent, it seems there has been societal retrogression since about 2015. Where do you think the extropian variant of transhumanism stands in particular? Do you believe it has been more widely embraced? Do you believe it has had an influence on the general culture, a kind of countervailing influence against these more toxic, divisive developments?
Well, I've been, for the last 10 years or so, I've been really focused on cryonics and been pretty busy with that. So I haven't really been doing very much with the extropian version of transhumanism, if you like. Maybe I should actually just sort of define things a little bit here for those who aren't familiar with the concept. What is the relationship between transhumanism and extropian transhumanism? The way I see it is that transhumanism is the all-encompassing term. It's a much broader term. You can have people who are transhumanists who are vegetarian, or meat eaters. You can have Christian transhumanists even. I would have thought that was difficult, but there obviously are a number of them. You can have Muslim transhumanists, presumably. So it's kind of a very broad term. I think you're a transhumanist so long as you agree and champion the core ideas of overcoming human limits, using rationality and technology to overcome limits with goodwill, and those core values. And within that, there can be a lot of variation. Extropian transhumanism is kind of a specific flavor of transhumanism in a way, in that it emphasizes certain principles in addition to those such as open societies. You can imagine, unless you want to define it so it's not true, you can imagine, you're looking at some of the historical writers who were sort of proto-transhumanists, you can imagine someone who believes that experts should rule everything. That's not an uncommon view these days, obviously. So you can imagine the kind of centrally controlled version of transhumanism, which I would greatly dislike, and that would not be an extropic form, because that really emphasizes critical thinking and open society. So, how far can you stretch it? Can you have a faith-based transhumanism? I would argue no. That would be contradicting its fundamental core principles of rationality that come from humanism. But beyond that, you can have all kinds of transhumanists, and they can disagree on a lot of other issues. So I haven't really had a lot of chance to work on extropian transhumanism. I think I want to do that in the future, because some parts of that need to come back. The critical rationalism needs to come back. The proactionary principle, I'd like to promulgate that further. That one has kind of taken off to some extent. But I kind of agree in a way. I think we see progress overall, but in the last number of years, we have definitely seem to have gone backwards in terms of our ability to talk civilly to each other with disagreements. It's easy to blame social media, and that probably does have a part of it, but let's not make excuses. We need to have some better norms here. And it's a very complex factor, what is causing that. But I would like to have people be less afraid of everything. Again, it's kind of a core part of transhumanism that we believe that progress is possible, but it's not inevitable. We have to actually work at it. And today, I see so much stuff out there with people thinking, it's very common, right? People say 2020 was the worst year ever. And I'm going, are you kidding me? You think 2020 was the worst year ever? Okay, so we had an increase in the mortality rate, but go back a while and see how many people died of all kinds of diseases in the past, even to the last pandemic we had. Let's go back to times where you didn't have rights, when no painkillers. I mean, it's just nuts to say that. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tough year, but come on, let's keep it in perspective. What's amazing about this is, if you look at some of the positive sides, the fact that we actually created a vaccine. Actually, I got a lot of people who don't know this. The vaccine was created almost a year ago, but we were not allowed to have it because of government regulation. Basically, it has to go through all these loopholes. It was created in a weekend, which is amazing. It's taken decades before for other diseases. In fact, some things don't even have a vaccine. So that's pretty amazing. I think we should be celebrating that and focusing more on why don't we have it yet. I think it's a good conversation to have there. So part of what I'd like to do is bring back some of those, emphasize certain aspects of extropian transhumanism along with the proactionary principle, which another principle that I came up with basically in response to the precautionary principle, which many people may have heard of, and which is actually enshrined in the European Union policy making. And basically, my version of the precautionary principle says, never try anything for the first time, which of course means you never actually get to do anything. Imagine the first person to come up with fire was faced by a regulatory council saying, you can't do that, that fire could get out of control and kill people. And so we'd still be living in the cold in caves. It's a super precautionary principle that really just stops you taking any kind of risk and just emphasizes the risks and not the benefits, which is stupid, because not taking risks means that you're never going to learn anything and never make anything better. So I developed the proactionary principle as a broader, more intelligent way of making decisions based on the best methods available, which balances both the pros and cons of new technologies and new procedures. So now that I'm no longer the main person in charge of Alcor, I have a bit more time to start working on this, maybe start writing again, and especially push out the proactionary principle some more. I think we need it today.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is perhaps the most important principle that the world needs today. And in the YouTube chat, I linked to an article of mine that was recently published on the US Transhumanist Party website called Reject the Deadly Precautionary Principle, Approve All COVID-19 Vaccines Immediately. And it referenced your work with the proactionary principle and pointed out exactly what you did, that Moderna had developed its vaccine during a weekend almost a year ago now, and had it been approved for distribution to just willing volunteers, nobody would have been forced to take this vaccine. But if people had the option, and it became apparent through empirical evidence that this worked, this was generally safe and generally quite effective, we would not have had the hundreds of thousands of deaths from COVID-19 that we're experiencing right now. And it seems to me the greatest moral error of our time is indeed this precautionary principle, because well-meaning people perpetrate it, and they do so in the name of safety, they do so in the name of scientific rigor, but what they don't realize is that there are great risks and dangers to the status quo, to doing nothing at all. So why do you think that error arises? It seems to be a systemic error in human thinking and policymakers thinking today. it wasn't necessarily always the case. We didn't have it during the Renaissance, during the Age of Enlightenment as much. This seems to be a more recent development, but it is pervasive.
Well, what's kind of ironic about this really is that the time for precaution really was in the past. Because if you think about it, if you live in a very poor society where you're depending on the one crop, and some guy comes along and says, I've got this radical new idea for farming. We're just going to completely transform the way we farm. Let's completely shift over to this new approach tomorrow. You might say, well, hold on a minute. If something goes wrong, we're going to starve. There's no Walmart. There's no canned foods. We have no backup. Whereas today we have, we can get things from other countries. We can do all kinds of experiments, and we have a lot more ability to absorb those kind of shocks. So it's actually, would it be more rational to be more cautious in the past than it is today? Really, to make real progress today, we've got to take some reasonable risks. So it's kind of odd that we have that backwards. We're getting more cautious culturally as time goes on, which is baffling. As to why that is, generally, I don't really have a great answer. It's something I need to really think about some more when I want to get back to this work. I think it's partly maybe a matter of society being ever more complex, and people, especially people who don't study economics and social systems and complex systems, don't know how to think about that, and they get kind of scared, and so they resort to the view that things must be getting bad, and we need to rely on experts to tell us what to do because I don't know what to do. And then they kind of tie themselves to whatever experts they've chosen, or whichever experts have the megaphone, which tends to be a very small fraction of them. And I think there's another factor which is certainly not new, but seems to have reached a critical level, which is that news media, obviously lots of people say this, it's true that news media has a strong incentive to catastrophize everything. They want to present the worst possible news they can. And that's why it's really not good for your mental health to look at the news too much. I'd rather get things from intelligent blogs and other kind of meta sources, because I don't really need to know how many people were raped or murdered or who burned down what yesterday, because they're not reporting all the good things that were done. In fact, one thing I'd want to do in the past, if I was if I was a billionaire, I would probably create a positive news network which focused on people inventing things, solving problems, doing good deeds. I think we need something like that. So obviously that's one factor that's driving this, but it is kind of baffling. I'm hoping that we go through these cycles, and maybe people will see, we just created a vaccine incredibly fast. We've got people building private space companies that are really inconceivable for the last several decades. We've got a lot of amazing stuff going on, and maybe we can turn this around. But I think part of the problem is political too. If people are so polarized and just hate each other so much, I don't know, we need to blow up the political system somehow, but I'm not sure how you can do that. It's hard to get a new party started in this country because of the party system. We don't have proportional representation, which has its own downsides. So it's really very hard to transform it.
We have spoken about the emotional limitations of the human psyche, and how humans are essentially, unfortunately, still these evolved hunter-gatherer types of entities that find themselves in an advanced, civilized, technological society, but really our brains are still qualitatively quite similar to the hunter-gatherer brains. So I do think this is neglected, not just in the general culture, but within the transhumanist community as well, especially when people just follow their initial inclinations, their initial impulses to judge something or someone. Sometimes they do resort to this primitive tribal hunter-gatherer type of thinking. And at the same time, while Elon Musk is working on Neuralink, and there are other incipient attempts at cognitive enhancement technology, we're clearly not there yet to systematically and reliably enhance the human mind through technological means other than the methods that have existed for centuries, like reading books or listening to more rational speakers or figuring out better communication strategies. So what do you think people can do in this interim before we have reliable, cheap, affordable, and massively available technologies of cognitive enhancement to get past this tribalism, to get past these divisions, both within the transhumanist community and within the broader world?
Well, thinking not so much about the individual level, but more sort of institutional level, there's a couple of things that we could do a lot more. Could be done in government, could be done in business, could be done in all kinds of groups. One of those is using things like decision markets, which we had writings on that back in X3 magazine back in the 80s, and there's been, and Robin Hanson was very much associated with that. And today you see quite a few betting markets which are actually really good. Just to take kind of a trivial one, there's the Hollywood Stock Exchange, which I guess not so much during the COVID days, but would forecast how much a movie would make in its first weekend. And there's other instances, like Hewlett Packard has an internal ideas futures market where they forecast how many printer sales or cartridge sales they'll make. And it turns out these betting markets, which you would think, how can they possibly work well? You've got people making all kinds of crazy bets and who may not know very much. But the fact is they outperform experts pretty much every time. If you have a well-defined question and you can make a well-defined forecast, the market comes to an answer which is better than any expert. So I think we should use those a lot more. I also like people like Brian Kaplan, an economist who has had a great record for making bets. I think he's got something like 20 of them maybe now. And he's won every one so far. And he's very keen on defining exactly what is it we're arguing about and what are you going to say has happened, what am I going to say has happened. And so I think it gives him credibility because you can just, if you don't like his ideas, you can dismiss them. But if he's won 20 bets in a row, you think, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. He only puts his money on things that he's pretty confident in. And so you have money to lose there. So that would be one thing we could do. Another very simple thing, which I don't know why this isn't done pretty much universally, especially at the level of government and policy, is to have opposing teams, the good old devil's advocate technique, basically, but formalized a little bit more. Where you have, and they've done this once or twice, but it's not a regular thing. Have people, they don't have to agree with the arguments they're making, by the way. You can just tell them, well, you're going to be the devil's advocate on this issue, and then they have to do a good job. It's actually a very interesting process. I quite enjoy doing that. I did one with an old friend of mine in Los Angeles once, where I had to take the argument of, I had to take the position of arguing for the existence of God, basically, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God, which usually I argue the other side of that, but that was kind of fun, and it makes you think much more carefully about the other side of the argument. So they do occasionally do these red team, blue team things, but that should really be standard. Anytime you have a major issue, you should have 2 or more groups set up whose job it is, whether or not they actually believe what they're saying, to make the strongest argument they can. There's a good historical example of this being done and not being done, both under the same president. You go back to JFK, with the Bay of Pigs decision, which was pretty disastrous. There was no dissenting voices there. Nobody was allowed to disagree. He took whoever's opinion it was and went with that. Whereas when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy actually did convene exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, 2 opposing groups who both made their case, and that came to a lot better ending in the end. So I think that doesn't require complex technology. Of course, we can use that, like using Zoom to bring experts together. We could use things like the Delphi technique. There's all kinds of methods, and I've talked about it in some of my writings on the fractionary principle, because one of those sub-principles is to use the best available means of making decisions, which is not what we do today. So that's kind of a couple of kind of off-the-cuff ideas that don't require any real technology.
Very interesting. And in the YouTube chat, Dan Elton pointed out that in the rationalist community, there is a practice called steel manning, which is trying to argue the opposite point of view as strongly as possible, the opposite of straw manning. And Edward Hudgens points out there was an attempt to have red team, blue team debate in the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency on global warming. Sadly, that was blocked. Now, on the other hand, in our internal chat here, Alexandria Black points out that she thinks lawyers are the main reason why we have the precautionary principle, that people are afraid to get sued in a litigious society. And it does seem, on the one hand, you're saying that a kind of adversarial format for the consideration of ideas, having them compete with one another, having robust exchange and debate about them, helps the better ideas win out. On the other hand, there are adversarial aspects of the US legal environment in particular, and that seems to be unlike any other legal environment in the world, where the adversity is of a certain kind or at a certain level, or perhaps of a certain degree of expense. That it actually becomes counterproductive, where everything can be incessantly litigated for years and decades. The idea of a speedy trial is essentially just a fiction within the Constitution now, and any innovator has to be ready to have his or her innovation challenged and have the funds to resist a massive lawsuit, be it from patent trolls or environmental groups or other special interests. So where do you think that distinction is between beneficial adversarial adversarial formats and detrimental adversarial formats?
Well, I think the kind of adversarial format I'm talking about is very different from the one you're talking about. What I'm talking about is really setting up, two or maybe more people to argue different points of view for a particular issue, and then it's dissolved, and then you do a different group for another issue. Whereas lawyers, they stay there, politicians stay there, and they gain more and more power, and they have more and more interest in feeding basically their supporters in their extreme points of view. So it gets worse over time. So it's kind of a very different system. I think another reason why we see that a lot in government, and I primarily focus on the USA, is because once you have large bureaucracies develop, and they tend to keep feeding themselves and getting bigger, they have an incentive to be very cautious. I mean, we can take the FDA as a good example of that, and some economists have written a lot about this. Imagine that you are the person who gets to approve a new drug or not. What incentive do you have to approve it? Really, none, because if something goes wrong, they're gonna, you'll probably lose your job, get in a lot of trouble. But if you do let it go through and it's a big success, how much credit will you get? None. So really, all your incentive is on the side of being precautious. Whereas the company itself, in a system, proper civil law, where you are liable for anything you've done really badly, well, if you put something out there and you fraudulently, you've misstated your data or you've been fraudulent, then yes, you should be liable. But if you put it out there and you say, look, we've got this new drug, we've only tested it on 116 people, this is the chance that this is by results merely by chance. You decide whether you want to take it. If you have informed consent, then you shouldn't be open to massive lawsuits. So the company then has to kind of balance the risks versus the benefits. So we've really got a system that is all in favor of risk. It's also different in different states. It's not just the US compared to other countries. I think that each state is quite different. For instance, I've got some quite good knowledge of this these days. The California legal system is an absolute nightmare. It's a lot worse than most other states. A number of reasons. One is they can multiply punitive damages by tenfold, where most other states is 2 or 3 times at the most. So that strongly incentivizes people to try and sue and their lawyers to take the job. There's also a different kind of legal system there. They have there is no motion for summary judgment in California, which is a mechanism that throws out a lot of trivial lawsuits and saves people a heck of a lot of money on lawyers because the judge can kind of get rid of it early on. Instead, they have this other process. I'm forgetting right now, but it's a very expensive and tedious process that can kind of bankrupt a lot of people. So I think we need to reform some of the laws. We need to have a better tort system. And I think there's a lot of kind of legal changes that could be made more generally. For instance, I am very much in favor of free markets in most areas. But when you talk about markets being free, what people have to understand is those markets are defined by the legal rules that shape them and surround them. So for instance, you can have very reasonable arguments about how long should patent protection be, or should there even be patent protection. And it does seem to me, one reason drugs are so expensive is the FDA, but it's also because of patent protection. Now, why should it be the same in each industry? Why should patents be the same number of years in each industry? That makes no sense because the generations of new products could be drastically different. Like, does it really make sense to have patents and copyrights in software code of the same length for extremely expensive drug development? Not necessarily. That's probably something that can be determined by a futures market. So there's a lot of areas we could tweak, I think, to make the system work better. But really, to shake things up, what I would like to see, and this isn't for any particular party platform, but I think I'd like to see every party adopt this. One thing I have to say that I think Trump did that I liked was his rule. I think it was with 1 in and 2 out in terms of regulations. I think we need to have more sunset laws so that the number of laws doesn't keep growing, which puts more and more power into the hands of experts and bureaucrats and makes us more and more helpless because you just can't keep up with those laws. So there should be sunset laws where they go out, after 10 years or something, they cease to exist unless they're voted back in. If you have that kind of system, you have to focus on the things that actually are useful and work, and focus on those because you can't vote in all those new laws all the time. So I think there's some structural changes we could make that would actually improve the working of our system a lot.
Yes, excellent suggestions, Max. And in the US Transhumanist Party platform, we do focus on a lot of these areas: patent reform, reducing the timeframes for medical patents, greatly reducing the requirements for FDA approval before a drug can be marketed to willing patients. So all of these are excellent ideas for policymakers more broadly to consider. Now I would like
Jeremy, before we move on, let me just make one extension of that. One thing that I find totally baffling, for instance, is, and again, let's take the FDA, because it's my favorite agency to hate. Does it really make sense that you have to go through 7 to 11 years and billions of dollars to get a drug approved when it's already been approved in England or somewhere in the European Union, who've done just as much work and are just as critical as the FDA? Why can't you get some kind of international pass once it's been tested in one country? Why do you have to go through the loops again? And in this country, it's even worse, because once the FDA's approved it, like with the vaccine, you then have to, in many cases, get the state to approve it. And you had Governor Newsom in California saying, I'm not sure we want people to have the vaccine yet. We're going to have to take a look at it with our own experts. Oh, great. Let's slow it down some more. So it's kind of ridiculous. We're supposed to be a global society. Let's actually act a bit more like it.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And now I would like to open it up to the panel with any comments or further questions on the areas that have been discussed: transhumanism, extropy, the proactionary principle policy. Dan, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, so this has been really interesting as someone who's relatively new to transhumanism. I found it really interesting you mentioned critical rationalism, because that's something I've learned about recently. And I wanted to show the viewers this book, The Beginning of Infinity, by the physicist David Deutsch. This book covers a lot of areas, but one of the things it does is it summarizes a lot of the ideas of Karl Popper, who was the original proponent of critical rationalism. And he talks about how democracy is one of the best forms of government because it allows for error correction. And when I was reading the Principles of Extropy, I noticed a lot of the language was a little bit similar to some of Karl Popper's language. You talk about fallibilism, how humans are, how we need open dialogue and critique and such. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about critical rationalism and how Karl Popper and other philosophers may have influenced you.
Yeah, well, Karl Popper definitely was an influence.
Oh, and also if there's any books you would recommend for.
I was just going to, yeah.
Yeah.
So
I have some of his books here. I'm wondering maybe where to start.
Yeah, I gave a talk in 1994 at the first Extro conference on this very topic, actually. I'd have to dig that up, and my website needs to be rebuilt in the next couple of months, and now I'm getting active again. I'll make sure that's on there. But I would recommend a particular book by William Warren Bartley III called, I think it's Retreat to Commitment. He's a lot more readable than Karl Popper. Now, Popper was brilliant, but he's German, and he writes in these incredibly long, ponderous sentences, and it's not that easy to get through, right? So Bartley is actually a lot more readable in that sense. But the core of the idea really, again, is that you can't really prove anything to be true. All you can do is hold an idea as useful. It's kind of a little bit to do with Peircean pragmatism in a way. You hold an idea as useful so long as it survives critical attacks. And you have to, of course, clarify the idea clearly enough to be refutable. And that's one of Popper's criteria of what is science. And of course, he wrote, obviously another theme here from Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, 2 or 3 volumes, one on Freud and one on Marx, as I remember. Excellent books. And he's kind of applying that principle of critical rationality to society, basically, and pointing out that the reason that open societies are good is because they can test ideas and they can throw them out. And democracy, or as I refer to it, constitutionally limited republic, which doesn't let democracy have all the power, because then it becomes more run by gangs, I think, of exactly what we're seeing today, those kind of problems. But yeah, basically a society in which you can throw out the rulers every so often, and I could have talked about how you could extend that to the laws. So Popper really did make parallels between those ideas. And it's kind of also relates, I guess, to evolutionary theory in a sense, because evolution doesn't really know how to, well, it doesn't know anything, right? But it doesn't, to anthropomorphize, it doesn't know how to prove, it doesn't know how to create a fit person or a fit animal. What it does is tries lots of different experiments, and then nature kind of selects out the ones that don't work so well. Now we can do a better job than that because we can have a bit more foresight and advanced planning, but that's the same kind of basic principle that the errors get corrected over time. So yeah, it's critical that we have our societies built that way and try to think that way ourselves. So Popper was pretty important. And I did read Bartley's book. I do recommend that one. So critical rationalism and pancritical rationalism are not too much difference. I guess the emphasis on pancritical rationalism is that you don't just apply critical rationality to everything else. You apply it to itself. You apply it to rationality itself. So it's kind of becomes a very philosophical issue. Now, how do you prove the laws of logic? Or why do you get to say that using logic is rational, whereas my praying to somebody and getting an answer in my head is not? I mean, so the answer really is, well, let's test each one out and see which one works best, and we'll see how that works. And obviously, to really have a good scientific concept, scientific theory, Popper's point was you have to define your terms clearly enough that you know how to test them. Obviously, in areas like physics, that's relatively easy. Well, maybe not in cosmology and some other areas, but generally, if you can observe what's going out there, you can see the motion of the planets, you can make very clear predictions, then you can maybe start to actually really test them. Now, the problem is, and the reason that Popper says you can't really prove your theory is correct is because there could be many different theories that explain the same phenomena. And so, over time, you might better get rid of some of those, but there's always new possibilities. Back in the old days, of course, the theory of epicycles that try to explain the motion of the planets and stars by using these increasingly complex epicycles. You have a cycle and a cycle within a cycle and a cycle within a cycle, and so they're kind of making these ad hoc adjustments to make theory match prediction, theory match reality. And of course, that doesn't work very well if you keep shifting your explanation. And that's kind of relates to his writings about Marx. That if you look at Marxism, it does a lot of the same things. Basically, it made very specific predictions in the early days that the rich would get richer, the poor would get richer, until there would be a revolution inevitably. That didn't happen. Wages started going up as human capital was built up. You think, well, surely that refutes Marx, right? Well, no, it's because something else happened and something else happened and something else happened. And so they never actually are willing to let the theory be refuted. So Popper makes very clear parallels between the progress of knowledge in societies and of scientific theories. There's a lot in common.
Great. Yeah, that's really interesting. I heard actually, I was in a virtual event with Mark Miller, who I understand was involved in extropianism, and he actually brought up the book Retreat to Commitment as well. So I'll definitely have to check that out.
You might better find my paper. I haven't tried looking for it, but my talk was called Pancritical Rationalism and Extropic Metacontext for Mimetic Progress. Bit of a mouthful.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. And I do think it is important for any philosophical framework or worldview to have built-in mechanisms for its own evolution. I had seen earlier on in my life what happens when a worldview does not have that, because I was present in many objectivist communities who followed the philosophy of Ayn Rand. And when I read Ayn Rand's works as a teenager, I thought they were brilliant. She made a lot of insights that were beyond what I could have arrived at using my own thinking. So I tried to adapt a lot of her thinking and apply it to contemporary questions and issues. And sometimes I agreed with her, sometimes I disagreed with her. I was surprised at how much resistance I faced from self-proclaimed advocates of rationality and individualism and critical thinking, because some of them took this dogmatic view of objectivism was just everything that Ayn Rand had ever written, and if you challenge at least a substantial portion of it or some statement of hers, you're therefore automatically irrational, evil, whatnot. And it astonished me how that way of thinking within that movement essentially deprived it of relevance in the broader world, because they couldn't essentially adjust themselves to address the issues raised by technology in the 21st century or the changing societal dynamics. Now, there were some objectivists who were better than that, who were more of the open school of objectivism, people like David Kelly or Edward Hudgens, who actually tried to do what you described, Max, and take a more scientific, evidence-based approach. What do you think it is that can help a community of people adopt that? Are there some norms, some principles, and some policies that can encourage that, as contrasted with dogmatism, as contrasted with every person thinking, well, the absolute truth has been arrived at, I have the absolute truth, and anyone who disagrees with me is an evil person who should be banned?
Mhm. Well, I think the example of the case of objectivism is actually a really interesting one based on what we've been discussing. I came across Rand when I was, I think, 18. And for a couple of years, I was very heavily into Rand and thought, yeah, she's right. And then I started looking at it a little more. I read, I think it was Roy Charles, he wrote a really interesting piece as to why, if you're an objectivist, why you should be an anarchist. And I read that and I thought, damn, he's right. And Rand is wrong on this. And I also thought she was wrong on free will and some other things. Why does objectivism get like that? I think there's a couple of reasons. One was a personality issue, that Rand was extremely domineering and controlling and totally convinced that she was right. And so she kind of conflated her philosophical views with her personality. That was clearly part of it. And that became part of objectivist culture, I think, and maybe attracted people who like that, who like the certainty. And that is the big question we can come back to, is the need for certainty. I'll come back to that. But I think there's actually some very clear philosophical foundational problems with objectivism that led to that result. It definitely is not critical rationalism. It's kind of funny because she criticized Immanuel Kant a lot. She really despised Kant and some other figures like that. And yet you find in her writing, but also Descartes, she despised Descartes and his search for the foundations of rationality. But she actually was very Cartesian. If you look at the fundamental part of the theory of knowledge, it's all about starting with something that you can't possibly deny. It's very Cartesian, right? But Descartes ended up at God being the first thing you really can't question. Rand had the laws of logic. So she basically said, this is something you cannot question, and built knowledge one step on another to create new ideas that you could be absolutely sure were right. Well, that's not how it works, right? That's not critical rationalism. It's really a whole web of ideas that you have to continually test and could fall apart. There is no foundational step that you can absolutely guarantee is right. The philosophers have tried that for ages and they fail, whether it's God, whether it's sense data, whatever your latest kind of is, it just doesn't work. So I think it was a combination of those two things, the philosophical structure, the foundational idea that was mistaken and dangerous, and her personality. But I think it's not to be too harsh on objectivists, because they're not that different from many other groups who get very certain. It's just that they're kind of really annoying because they say how rational they are and then they don't necessarily act rationally. Again, some people are a lot better, as you mentioned. I think David Kelly is a good example of that. But I think there's an underlying problem, which I'm not sure how we overcome that very easily, which is we have this apparently deep-seated need for certainty. And by we, I mean all human beings. That's why we have so many fanatical religious and political views. People want to have certainty in their lives. They have a hard time with things like cryonics, for instance, because we don't offer certainty. I guess we could, we'd probably do better, but it wouldn't be very honest. So people come up and say, well, what you're offering me is immortality, right? I say, no. First of all, I can't possibly offer immortality because I'm not sure the universe is going to last forever. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know what the odds of it working for you are. So they don't really like that, because they want to either know in their head to know that they're going to go to an afterlife when they die, or they want to know for sure they're going to be gone and that's it. They want to have that certainty. The idea that there's a chance it might work makes them really uneasy and uncomfortable. They just don't like that. Plus, they're coming back into a future which is uncertain. But it's weird, isn't it? Because why are they so sure that if they go to a heaven, they're going to like it? I mean, I've never seen a description of heaven that looks interesting or appealing to me. Am I playing the harp all the day? Am I just basking in God's light? I mean, what am I doing? Do I have a life? Do I have a job? Do I have anything to do? Am I just going to be eating grapes all the time? It's very puzzling. They don't really seem to ask those questions. And I used to teach philosophy of religion. I would ask people that, my students, many of whom were Catholics, because there are a lot of Hispanics. I would say, well, have you thought about what it's actually like in heaven? Do you have a body? Do you have a gender? Do you have a job? And I just kind of push them on those, and they get really uncomfortable because they hadn't thought about that. I also like to joke when I'm discussing cryonics and religion that if you do believe in an afterlife, why are you so sure you're going upstairs and not downstairs? Don't you want this as a backup plan? Especially for the kind of Christian who believes that salvation comes through your works and not just kind of predestination. It gives you more time to save souls and spread the word and do good things. So for that reason alone, maybe you should think seriously about doing cryonics.
Yes, and you know, it might be an interesting discussion to have with a religious person who believes in a literal heaven and sees it as a reason to reject approaches toward life extension in this world. I should try that sometime. But now let's go to Jose. Jose, what are your questions for Max?
Well, Max, first of all, congratulations for all your work on your commitment to these ideas, extropy, transhumanism, and the future. So my question is, because you have been involved in this for so long in our times, for at least 3-4 decades, even 5 decades, as you said, when you saw the Apollo landing on the moon. How do you see the future? How do you compare the last 40 years with the next 40 years? Do you think this is accelerating or this is linear? How fast do you see the changes coming up into the future based on your experience with the past?
Okay, the singularity or not question, basically. Yeah, as some of you may know, I'm sort of a singularity skeptic. I've had a debate with Ray Kurzweil on this, and not that I disagree with the picture of overall accelerating change, but I think the specific view that Ray has presented ignores a number of factors. It ignores institutional factors, regulatory factors, psychological factors, all kinds of things that can slow things down. So I tend to be more of a surge guy rather than a singularity guy. I think that we get these surges in activity where things take off and they slow down, and then a new technology comes along and may speed it up again. So I don't see a single accelerating trend for everything. I understand Ray's arguments that computers are infiltrating themselves into pretty much everything, and that's got to speed things up. But not necessarily. If you've got heavy regulation, enormous costs imposed on you, and there's legacy systems that people want to make use of, it really slows things down. I certainly saw it when when I was working in the late 90s and the thousands for a consulting company and writing a lot of stuff for the website. I got very familiar with things like business information systems. What do they call it? Things like Salesforce. This kind of sales management systems, and these huge software structures that are supposed to make everything run much more efficiently. And you think, well, these are amazing pieces of technology, but they don't necessarily work well if they don't take into account psychological factors. Like you give people a sales tool where they can share their leads and improves communication. Well, if you don't change the incentives, the way you pay the salespeople, they're going to keep hold of that data pretty tightly, maybe even steal your data. So you have to kind of look into those factors. So having more computer power doesn't automatically mean things move faster. There's a lot of factors involved. That said, I do think in general things are speeding up when they're allowed to. The vaccine is a very good example of that. And I think it's a good time for us to push this because now a lot of people are becoming aware of this, that we did actually get the vaccine out a heck of a lot more quickly, but it could have been a lot quicker still. And why haven't we done that? And we started to have that idea back in the AIDS days when they made a kind of a special exemption for AIDS, and things happened a lot faster back then. I think this is a very good time to keep pushing on that and keep forcing that progress to speed up. So yeah, I think there are areas like that. Drug discovery is a particularly promising one, and I'm fairly optimistic that in the next 10 years or whenever, we may actually have thought about possible diseases, not just ones that come up at the time, but we may think ahead. Like we can kind of figure out all the different coronaviruses that there could be, and some people are actually doing this now, where they're designing ahead so we'd have vaccines available immediately, maybe even produced already. So that's an exciting thing. I do think finally, space to me is a good example of why it's not just a continuous curve. Right? When the Apollo mission stopped, things pretty much fell apart because the reason those things happened so amazingly well in those 9 years was really political competition. Right? And once that went away, there was no real incentive. But now we're back to a period where private individuals and companies are doing this and they're basing it on something more sustainable. And so that's giving me cause for optimism. So I think we will probably see accelerating improvement in space technology. So it really depends on the particular area we're talking about. You can also see things like, obviously the internet's developed incredibly fast, but it goes in different directions. And I think, some of the social media isn't necessarily all that beneficial. And I think we have to learn how to deal with that better. I'm not super pessimistic. I think we do learn to deal with these things. It's like, if you watch old movies where they just got telephones in, they're kind of holding the phone out here and they're yelling at it. And they don't really know how to interact with it yet. So it does take us time to get used to these things.
How about longevity? Because when you began talking about these ideas in the 80s, we didn't know that we could actually extend our lifespans, and now we do. So what is your forecast on longevity? And then plan B, cryonics.
Well, yeah, it's a good one for me, because honestly, when I was in my 20s, I thought that by now we would have made much more advances than we have in life extension. And really been very little. We've been eking out, a couple of months a year in overall lifespan, but we're not moving the maximum lifespan at all right now. So there are some interesting ideas out there and treatments, but we've really got a long way to go. And I'm honestly not that optimistic that I'll live long enough to benefit from longevity escape velocity, the idea that we'll extend our lives by more than 1 year per year. I might, it's really hard to say, but that's why I think cryonics is a very important backup plan. Not even a backup plan, it should be part of your portfolio of life extension options. I see it as kind of like investing in stocks and bonds and real estate. You have to spread your investments a little bit. So I think cryonics is a very important part of that longevity portfolio. I'm not going to make a prediction as to when we'll really stop aging. I really don't know. I know Aubrey is more willing to make confident statements about that, and I hope he's right. And as you would certainly acknowledge, it depends very much on how much we fund it and promote it. And that has not been something that's ever been done. Right? The National Institutes on Aging spend huge amounts of money, but not really on aging. That might start to change. Certainly compared to 30 years ago or 20 years ago, there's vastly more discussion of life extension research and more companies popping up. So that's kind of exciting. That could speed things up a lot. But I'm not putting all my bets on any one approach particularly. So sorry I can't give you a date, but I'd have to put money down if I did that. And I'm not confident enough to do that.
It's interesting because I had an interview with Ray Kurzweil at RADFest in 2018, and I specifically asked him about his debate with you in 2002 and whether he has changed his outlook on the inevitability of the technological singularity. And he essentially acknowledged that he doesn't dispute the contingency of his predictions on societal or political or other institutional conditions. He has said that his time frame for the development of certain technological capabilities has generally materialized, but the societal adoption has been slower than he had expected. Autonomous vehicles are a good example. He thought there would be autonomous vehicles in 2009, and the technology for autonomous vehicles, with some imperfections, did exist back in 2009. They were competing in DARPA events, but the public was so skeptical, and still large segments of the public are skeptical, that there hasn't yet been as widespread adoption as we would like, perhaps. So perhaps the views of yourself and Ray Kurzweil are converging in light of the empirical evidence, but it'll be interesting to see how they evolve over the next decade as well. Now, Arin, you have a question for Max.
Indeed, I do. So firstly, Max, it's an honor and pleasure to have you here. I've been following your work for a while. I have a question for you, not in regard to cryonics or anything in particular, rather a general question. Given your vast experience as being such an important figure in transhumanism and being a torchbearer, what would you recommend that everyday people can do, maybe for someone who's not involved in the longevity industry or in the technology industry? What can the average person do to spread transhumanism and make it more mainstream? Right, because we have a lot of brilliant people in the movement, but I think what transhumanism really needs is a push to have it become more mainstream. And if you might have any ideas about how the rest of us, what the rest of us can do to help push it forward.
Well, I think one thing that anybody can do, well, maybe not anybody, you may have to work on yourself a bit first. I think one thing many people can do is simply to talk to other people a lot about these ideas, not to be shy about them, not to be apologetic. I've never had a problem with that myself. I always talked to my professors at USC. I talk to anybody about it. And I think if you do that without being obnoxious and pushy, proselytizing, you want to stimulate a conversation, that will get the ideas spread to more and more people, I think, very effectively. Because a lot of those people may not read blogs or scientific papers or, come to meetings like this. But if you talk to them human to human or transhuman to human or whatever, and do it nicely, with good information, I think that's very important. That's something to be a very distributed process. So that's kind of a low-tech answer, but I think that's an important part of it. I think also
Yes.
important to think about how can you apply these ideas in your life right now, without having to get chips stuck under your skin. Don't do things just because they may be new, but what actually is useful to do. And like with life extension, what measures can you take today that may buy you a little bit of extra time, and maybe what's too risky? That may depend on how old you are. I think the older I get, the more I'm willing to take risk because there's less to lose and there's more to gain. So if you're in your 20s, I don't really recommend you try anything too radical. But I'm about to turn 57. I'm starting to get a little worried, so I'm going to try some more things that maybe a little bit more risky if they have a good payoff.
Yes, I completely agree with that. One should be more risk averse when one is younger, which is actually why I took up trail running in my 30s. In my 20s, I would largely run indoors on an elliptical trainer, but that's just a kind of example, perhaps a small personal example of a move away from more risk aversion when I was young toward perhaps more of a moderate level of risk tolerance as I become older, which is the opposite of what a lot of people think in mainstream society.
Right.
A lot of people think in mainstream society, when you're young, you take all of these risks because, oh, you'll have all the time in the world to make up for them. Well, unless they're risks with your health, in which case you could damage really excellent health that you have by default as a young person. But when you're an older person, you also start risking a lot by doing nothing, by not pursuing innovative treatments that could potentially prevent disease. So those are great points. Now, I wanted to ask you, with regard to your philosophical writings on personal identity, you have a treatise from 1995 called The Diacronic Self, which explores a series of questions that I have pondered on for some time. And those are, what are the preconditions for the continuity of the self, that which we are trying to preserve through various life extension approaches? What approaches will result in the same individual continuing versus perhaps a different individual coming about, a copy, someone who might think they're you, but they're not really you, because the you that got destroyed, if you get destroyed, won't feel anything, won't experience the world through their vantage point. So where would you draw that distinction between a process that preserves the same individual and a process that creates a different, albeit very similar individual?
Well, they're going to all the different details and varieties in my dissertation, which, by the way, is on the web. It's probably one of the more read dissertations out there because it has a lot of fun thought experiments. You can find it on my blog, actually. The answer really is there is no line to draw. I don't believe there is kind of black and white there. I think it's a matter of degree, in a sense that you continue to the extent to which there is psychological continuity and connectedness. I'm very much a Parfitian. If you look at Parfit's excellent book, Reasons and Persons, he pretty much set out the view of personal identity that I think is closest to the truth. I think he went wrong in the latter part of the book, but the basic theory is, I think, about right. And that's really a matter of degree, because we have, well, unless something goes seriously wrong overnight and you have like a massive stroke or something, when you wake up the next morning, you have almost complete psychological connectedness and continuity with the person you were yesterday. So you feel pretty comfortable in thinking that's you. There are some people I know out there who actually seriously worried that they died during the night and now it's a new person because there was a period of no consciousness and no dreaming, and that lack of conscious awareness somehow means the person's gone. That doesn't, to me, that doesn't make any sense. There is that continuity and connectedness that matters. Now, we can imagine that various changes can happen, greater or smaller ones. You go out there and have run into a car or something, or have a big accident and bash your head in, and your personality changes drastically. Well, the question is, are you the same person or not? My answer is, well, yes and no. You can't really say yes or no. It's kind of a bit of both. It's a matter of how much change you think is too much. What are the most important aspects of you, first of all? That's something I discuss in my dissertation. It's not, for instance, for me, memory isn't as important as a lot of philosophers of identity who really talked about memory continuity. To me, that's not the most important thing. I think I can imagine losing many of my actual decorative memories. As long as I kept my procedural memories, I think I'll be basically the same person. I have the same values and the same ways of behaving. And that to me is more important, is having those core values and ways of behaving remain. So, I mean, I don't have a great memory. I've forgotten a lot of stuff from the past. I don't tend to dwell on it very much. I don't feel I've lost who I am. I feel very much the same person I was decades ago, as that core person that's still there. But there's all kinds of in-between cases like that. We can certainly talk about slapping chips into our brain or rewiring the brain. And I think one thing is it depends on not just how quickly you do that, but how well you integrate these changes. If someone is imposing a change on you from the outside, it tends to be a lot more disruptive. If you choose a change and you have to work on it and take time to integrate it with the rest of yourself, it becomes part of you, it becomes integrated with you. So if you change too rapidly and too drastically at once, you might really have concerns that it's not really you or not enough you. The same kind of questions I have with cryonics, by the way, that will it work? Well, it might work partly and only partly. If you don't get a perfect cryopreservation, for instance, there may be some loss of memory and personality. Well, how much of that is too much? I'd rather take my chances with coming back as much as I can, but I may not have everything, and I'm willing to live with that. Again, it goes back to that issue of certainty, right? And the demand for absolute certainty. Well, we can't offer that. So it's, there's a lot of nuance to that if you read my dissertation, but that's kind of the core of my answer. Is it's all about continuity and connectedness, and it's really a matter of degree. And you can, I think, in which chapter it was, I think it was the third chapter, I really explore technology's effects on continuity and to what extent that's going to blow up your identity. I guess one other point to make is, to me, it's not identity that matters, actually. It's not being logically the same person, because that kind of implies transitivity of identity. Imagine that there's one of me now, but what if I was to split into two, or two new individuals, is to say, well, transitivity of identity is lost, so the same person isn't there, the personal identity is being lost. But the way I look at it is, I don't really care that much. I care about continuity. Now, there's two of me. That's just as well, almost as good as one of me. We're going to have to argue over who gets Natasha, right, and my house and so on. But other than that, practical issues like that, I've survived. I've survived twice. So yeah, I've lost logically identity, but I don't think that's really what matters. That's not really. It's kind of a mistaken idea in philosophy that we really have to have identity. It's continuity that matters to me.
So, in my view, what matters to me is the direct experience of the world through my vantage point. So I don't care so much. Well, I would care, but it wouldn't destroy me to lose all my memories if I had amnesia. But I still had essentially the same physical body, the same brain. I would still experience the world as me. I would just have to rediscover my history. I would have to rediscover my past, etc. And I could do that through my writings, through what people say about me, provided that it's accurate. And I could gradually learn about that, and it would start seeming familiar to me. On the other hand, if somebody assembled an atom by atom identical replica of myself right next to me, and that person would go off and do his own things, he might think he's me, he might have the same memories, but I would still be here talking to you, and from that point in time, our paths would diverge. If I were destroyed, this original me would not be experiencing the world from his vantage point. So that would be kind of like leaving a legacy. It might be nice to have someone who is that similar to me, but I would still not have what I call the I-ness, which is that unique quality of being able to directly experience the world through my own vantage point. And I have been thinking about what preserves that. So for instance, sleep does preserve that in my view, because you still have the physical continuity of bodily processes. Even if you're not aware of the world, you still have your brain supplied with the essential prerequisites of life. Likewise, general anesthesia, it does not lead to a cessation of all bodily processes. You're still breathing, your heart is still beating. It just slows down a lot of processes and you're not aware of it. So I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with the Star Trek teleporter scenario where you're disassembled atom by atom and reassembled from new atoms, because again, there doesn't seem to be any direct transference of that direct awareness of the world. There would be somebody on the other end who perceives the world in a very similar manner to me, but I, the person who went into the teleporter, would not have that prospective continuity. So I had a disagreement with Kenneth Hayworth on a prior virtual Enlightenment Salon, because his whole technique for living longer essentially was to go into aldehyde stabilized brain preservation, where one's brain and body get injected with glutaraldehyde, and then in the future, because it's very difficult to reverse the fixation, one's brain would just essentially get uploaded in micro slices, provided that the technology in some remote future century is available to do that. There might be an emulation of oneself in a digital format. Maybe it could get instantiated into a physical body. But I see that as just a time-delayed version of the Star Trek transporter. I don't see that as preserving the I-ness. Where would you stand in terms of whether you think that's the same person, a copy? Would it preserve what we essentially want to preserve about ourselves, which is our ability to live and experience the world directly?
Well, I do address that in the dissertation, actually. Again, there's a lot of fun thought experiments about teleporter beams, and what if you use the same atoms to reconstruct you at the other end? Does that make a difference? What if we create two of you and you've got to share those atoms? What if we start with new atoms? So there's a lot of interesting possibilities to sort of pull at your intuitions. Certainly, from my point of view, I come to this question a lot with people thinking about being revived from cryopreservation, for instance, because as you say, there's two quite different options. You can come back in the same body, or essentially the same body that we've repaired, and pretty much everybody is generally comfortable, unless they have a continuity of consciousness view, they're generally comfortable that will be them. But what if you instead have your brain scanned, as you talked, Ken's version of that, and come back as an upload? Is that you? Well, this is a very tricky question, and I certainly understand your intuitions on that. I personally think that I would survive as an upload. I think there'll be continuity of the kind that I care about, but obviously it requires certain philosophical assumptions that regular revival and biologically doesn't. So that's certainly the more conservative option, and the one that I tend to stress. The chemical preservation approach doesn't have as many advantages as some of its proponents think it does. They think it would be a lot cheaper, for instance, and it really wouldn't. You'd still have to have a standby team to get you very quickly, because otherwise you're going to decay quickly. There's problems getting the glutaraldehyde fixation all the way into the brain, because generally it's done on very thin tissue slices, so there's big issues there. It does have some advantages for long-term storage, certainly. You don't have to maintain super cold temperatures. But then, the big one is, do you think that will be you coming out the other end? What if we could bring back the biological you and the upload? So again, I personally would see that as me having survived in two individuals. But I do understand why that's a pretty hard thing to swallow for many people. And I'm not going to try and convince anybody that's the correct view today. But no, I do think I can survive a change of platform, essentially. Now, it's a little easier if instead of having a whole new person created out of nothing or out of your brain scan, what if we say, let's replace one of your neurons at a time with a field effect transistor or some kind of mechanical component, and there may be no interruption in consciousness or thinking. Now, are you the same person at the end of that? And now you're entirely made out of some silicon or optical device and not biological neurons. Do you think that's still you? Well, I think it would be, but what about you, Gennady?
Yes, I would agree with you. So let's say you have some pill that you take, and that pill contains a few artificial neurons, and you take your artificial neuron pill once a day. Somehow they get through the blood-brain barrier and they integrate into your brain. They essentially graft themselves onto it and bear some of the same cognitive load. And over time, they just serve the same function as your regular neurons, and over time, say with biological aging, the regular neurons start dying off, but you've taken more and more of these artificial neurons. So let's say after 100 years, your entire brain consists of the artificial neurons. I would say that is you, because process continuity has been preserved. Just as people lose cells all the time, they grow new cells, and those cells, they're functionally doing the same work as the prior cells. That is the same person. If, however, you had a surgery where somebody took out your brain and replaced it with an artificial version of your brain that has the same content and supposedly would be able to work, integrate with your body, overcome immune resistance, etc., I don't think that would be you, because your original brain is out there, maybe not even alive anymore. That would definitely just be a new person who thinks that he's you. So I do think the gradual nature of the process and the uninterrupted nature of life is needed for that. But yes, that would be you.
It's funny how people take the Star Trek transporter kind of in stride, and they don't really seem to. If you make people really think about it, they do start getting very uncomfortable. Is that really just killing everybody all the time and replacing them? But we usually watch that. Nobody considers that. And that kind of a parallel to that is, what about people who do believe in an afterlife? That body's gone, it's gone and decayed, and yet they think there is somebody in an afterlife that's them. What is it that's continued exactly? People say, well, the soul. And I would say, well, what is the soul? It doesn't seem to be the same thing as personality. It's certainly not the same thing as body. So why should I care about my soul? That becomes especially pressing if you believe in reincarnation. You can come back as an entirely different person, different personality, or even a different species. In what sense is that still you? And what good is that? Is the soul in that case? It doesn't seem to be much of a comfort to me.
I think the concept of a soul is an early attempt to approximate this idea of I-ness that I was discussing, which is very intuitive because it's felt directly by all of us, but it's difficult to have a vocabulary that encompasses it and works out all of its implications without lapsing into errors. So a lot of people think, well, it's inconceivable to imagine a world where I don't exist. How is it even possible to think about complete nothingness? It's not like, oh, you're just asleep for a long time. No, it's nothing. Even talking about it is kind of strange because you don't experience anything. You don't have any memories of having existed. So to many people, that's just such a strange idea that they think something has to survive, something has to persist after the death of the body. And this is, I think, where reincarnation arises. But of course, they don't have a physical mechanism for that persistence. They don't have a causal mechanism for that persistence other than that they have faith that this happens, be it through some sort of otherworldly realm or reincarnation.
What's odd about that is people don't really think parallel or symmetrically about that. For instance, I could point out that, you didn't exist for billions of years before you were born, but you don't seem to be too upset about that. So why should we be upset about not existing in the future? Often people, when I'm discussing life extension or cryonics, will say, well, are you doing this because you're afraid of death? And I answer perfectly honestly, no, I'm not afraid of death because there's literally nothing to be afraid of. I won't be there in a dark room feeling this is really boring. I just won't be there. So there's literally nothing to be afraid of. What I'm afraid of is losing all the good things that are part of life. It just is incoherent to be afraid of death or being dead. I'm afraid of the dying process. That can suck, but not of being dead.
Yes, as I often like to put it, fear of anything arises out of a related love of something that one stands a chance of losing. And I think any time somebody speaks of fear of death, that's really just an implication of love of life. They don't want to lose the good things in life, as you've stated. Now, Alexandria, if you're there, you mentioned you would like to discuss the topic of dementia. I think it's relevant to continuity of identity. So what are your thoughts on that?
We enjoyed speaking with Natasha last week, and she gave us some background of your mother-in-law's last year. So I'm sure you have some experience with dementia. And it's hard to say that mom's continuity of mind, I mean, she's in there, but it just blinks through. Like, for example, her sock fell off and she'll say her foot fell off, this kind of thing. I've been trying to get her some ISRIB to clear out some of the senescent crap in her brain. I mentioned this to Natasha. And I think that's also relevant to Alcor, that you would want to send these brains into cryo in better condition if this small molecule ISRIB. In fact, there's more research on it than, now that I've checked, than Susanna Rosie's recent paper. So I'm wondering, with that knowledge, what you might do with it with Alcor, and also what insights do you have about that degradation of self that we see in dementia?
Yeah, dementia I talk about, I'm afraid of the dying process itself. That, of course, is one of the things that is most worrying to me. I can deal with a lot of physical disability. My friend Hal Finney, who quite well-known alcohol member, who was the first recipient of a Bitcoin, I saw him dying of ALS, And for him, it was worth living until he could no longer communicate. So he could be unable to move or do anything, but as long as he could communicate using his eyes, using a computer program, he just looks at butts of the screen and spells out messages. But if you're losing your mind, that's pretty bad. And I honestly think it should be legal for people to choose to terminate their life functions so they could be cryopreserved under good conditions before their brains are destroyed. Now, the complication here is I'm not an expert in dementia or amentia or any of those versions of it, or Alzheimer's, but I do believe there is some evidence, at least for Alzheimer's, I'm not sure if it applies to other forms of dementia, that the person is really still there. It's just that they can't express themselves. There's a recent paper on this that reinforces my suspicion on that. And one reason I guess I thought about it before was you commonly hear the experience of people talking to the older relatives who have dementia, and one day they're kind of there, the next day they're not, then they are, then they're not. So it doesn't seem like it just goes. It's more a matter of the brain loses the ability to reach down into the memories or to remember what's going on, but then sometimes it connects back up again. So that gives me hope that even people with severe Alzheimer's disease are actually still preserved, and we can rebuild those brains and bring back the memories. So I'm fairly optimistic about that. I can't say that's true of all forms of dementia. I don't know enough about them, yeah, that's a pretty scary idea of losing yourself while you're still physically living. And of course, that's a sense in which you can be gone even while your body is alive. The person's actually gone. You just have a body, and of course, that's why we have concepts of brain death. Because there are times where it's really just a body and there's nobody there anymore. On the flip side of that is, of course, with cryonics patients, I think there should also be a law that just because you're not living doesn't mean you can be treated as dead. You're kind of you're like a person in a long-term coma, except with no metabolism. It's basically an ametabolic coma. And you should have rights that go along with that. Basically, you don't want to just hack your arm off or come take away your brain or something like that. You still have those rights. So we need to understand there's something in between being alive and being dead, which is kind of like, Gennady, the idea of being dead is hard to wrap your head around. Well, the idea that you're neither alive nor dead is very hard for people to wrap their heads around too. But if you define life as a set of processes, metabolism and respiration, and whatever the qualities are, cryonics patients don't have those. But if they could, but they're not dead, because what that really means is the information that's in the brain that makes you who you are is gone. Well, if neither of those are true, you're not alive or dead. You're kind of in a third state, as I've written. Mm-hmm. So all these things get very complicated, and there's partial survival, and dementia could be a case of that.
Yes, and these are extremely interesting issues to consider, including from a policy standpoint, but the idea that the content of a person's mind might still be there with conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia, that could be analogous to, for instance, a computer hard drive that has all of the information on it that one would want to retrieve, but perhaps one of the wires within the computer that connects the hard drive to some of the other components is imperfectly connected. So sometimes there might not be enough of a signal. At other times, there might be enough of a signal for that information or some of it to come through. But it is actually for that reason that I prefer to give the benefit of the doubt to patients with dementia or Alzheimer's and think they might have something there. They might have something that could come back with the proper medical technology. So would you say there is a benefit for somebody who has that condition to wait until the very end and then still go into cryonic suspension, because perhaps in the future, these future technologies could reconnect the wire or even reconstruct some of the content that was lost by reference to, say, a person's mind file if they've collected enough information about themselves?
Yeah, I think that's very much an individual decision. My personal preference is I'd want to be cryopreserved well before the end, because I'm not sure how well that is going to be preserved. But other people may want to wait that long. So it's, I don't think it'd be a right answer for every person. It's probably worth mentioning along these lines that Alcor is making more of an effort these days to offer other forms of preservation to, so if you don't take everything with you, if there's delays in getting you cryopreserved or it doesn't work that well for you, can we interpolate old memories from your mind files, from your written records, from your photographs? I'm sure there'll be some very sophisticated software in the future that could absorb all your writing and all your Facebook posts and all these videos and kind of fill in some of the gaps. We actually do offer storage in an underground salt mine for important documents. People can use things like M-disks. Some of you may have heard of M-disks. They're basically kind of a special form of CD that has been shown to last for like 1,000 years, and they'll survive all kinds of heat and cold. They're more expensive than regular ones, but they will preserve your photos and so on for a lot longer. We've also recently started a reintegration working group. Basically, we're spending a lot of time thinking about how will we bring you back and what will that be like and how can we make it easier and how can we plan ahead for that. So we're actually working on an idea for a patient portal where, while you're still walking around, you can actually send information of all these different kinds, kind of like the mind file and things like Martin Rothbard have done, to provide all that information in a way that could fill in the gaps and help you to become back more whole.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And those are promising projects. I hope that they advance and come to fruition. Now, before we go to closing remarks from the panel, I'd like to ask you one final question about cryonics, and that is, what do you think is needed for cryonics to become seen as a mainstream alternative to burial or cremation so that it could be offered by funeral homes as a standard option, even if the funeral director doesn't believe in the possibility of eventual revival? From a pure market-based standpoint, there should be no reason why somebody couldn't come in and be faced with three choices instead of two. Well, you could get buried, you could get cremated, or you could get cryopreserved, and the funeral home would help you with that. What do you think are the barriers to that happening today, and how could that become a default option available to people?
Well, I think there's quite a few obstacles, including some things we discussed, like this idea of life and death being binary. People need to understand that's not right, and it takes a bit of work to get them to see that. I think it really helps that we're seeing more and more work in low temperature medicine and low temperature surgeries. And more and more stories of people, especially children, because of the higher surface area to volume ratio, falling into cold water, slowing down the metabolism and surviving after an hour of clinical death. And people who start thinking about that start realizing it's not black and white. You're not suddenly dead in an instant. And whenever I'm explaining the idea, I always point out to people that in 1960, before we had CPR and defibrillation, if you stopped breathing and your heart stopped beating, we just said, he's dead, Jim, and that's it. We kind of throw up our hands and gave up. Today, we don't do that. We realize that they're not dead. They're clinically dead, actually. They are clinically dead because that's how it's defined, but they're not dead. And so we need to do something for them to help them. So when we cryopreserve someone today, they're not really dead. They're actually badly in need of more advanced medical services. So just as we can help people today who we couldn't help in 1960, obviously in 2080 or 2100 or whenever, we'll better fix a lot of the conditions that we can't fix today. I think I lost the shred of the original question. Now I had something else to say.
So the original question was, how could we bring about a situation where funeral homes offer this as a default option?
All right, so I think overcoming those kind of mistaken conceptions, understanding how we're using cold temperatures in medicine is all very helpful. And I think obviously another part of it is people who are seen as respectable and smart, publicly talking about why they think this is a good idea, that should help. I'm not talking about, necessarily singers. And I think more people I wish Stephen Hawking had been cryopreserved because people had tremendous respect for him. It's kind of very sad that we couldn't really get through to him. But people who have a lot of respect, if they start doing it, that starts to shift public opinion, because maybe it shouldn't, because it should be just the arguments were enough, but we know that's not how most people's minds work. We have actually had interest from some funeral homes saying, we'd like to be able to offer this as an alternative. And I think that might happen one day. Probably not so much the funeral industry, but more hospitals. I do think that at some point in the future, every major hospital will have a cryonics unit, so that you will transition from urgent critical care, trying to keep you alive, when we realize we really can't do that, or it's just too painful and it's not going to fix anything. We transition to the cryonics unit, which would be set up to do the initial cooling procedures, total body washout, cryoprotection, and so on, and then probably be transferred to a more specialist cryonics organization for long-term storage. And I've really seen people change in the last 20, 25 years from medical professionals, from people who say, well, this is just a crazy idea, this can't possibly work. And now the more common reaction is, oh yeah, I've seen you guys on the Science Channel or on the Discovery Channel. That's really interesting. Can we watch? Rather than throwing us out of the hospital. So I think it's going to be a gradual thing. I think having maybe some well-known, respected people will help speed that up. But yeah, as I say, I think one day we'll look back on today and we'll just kind of scratch our heads and shake our heads and wonder, think, how could people be so freaking stupid? How could they just take their loved ones and bury them in the ground to be munched on by worms and bacteria, or shove them into a huge oven to be incinerated, when they could have given them a chance of being cryopreserved? It's just absolutely baffling that we were so insane back then. So we'll get there eventually.
It's interesting. Culture has a lot to do with it, because the Egyptians, while they didn't have the science to actually understand that the brain contained human memories and ability to perceive the world, they had the general right idea of trying to preserve what they thought was important. And yet somehow in the contemporary world that has been lost or underappreciated.
Yeah, the Egyptians unfortunately had absolutely the wrong way of going about it. Of course, sucking the brains out through the nose is not going to help preserve your identity very well. But a lot of people didn't think that's where you were back then. Aristotle didn't think that's where you lived. So yeah, they had the right basic idea, but absolutely the wrong approach in technology.
Yes, indeed. So now the time has come for our regular process of asking each of the panelists to provide closing remarks regarding what they thought of this conversation, any additional comments or insights or questions that they would have, and then we will conclude with our guests having the last word. So let's go to David Shoemaker for his closing remarks.
Yes, hi, Max. Thank you so much for being here today. And more important than that, thank you for everything that you've done for transhumanism and for cryonics. And just wonderful to share the same state of Arizona with you. So I'll put in a shameless plug for Alcor and cryonics, as I'm signed up for that. I'm not too worried about the continuity of self. I think that as long as I wake up again someday and look around and go, gee, I think I'm me, that's going to be good enough for me. But thank you so much. Just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, David, for your comments. And now I'd like to hear from another big cryonics advocate, our 2020 US presidential candidate, Charlie Ken.
Hey, Max, good to see you. Like David, I'm going to show off my membership too. I've got the cryonics Alcor necklace. I think, you know, as Gennady mentioned, I ran for the USTP presidency under the USTP party banner. And what's unique to our party is that we are very fervent believers of the option of cryonics, unlike any other party, really. And so that question would come up, you know, and I had different answers for different people. And of course, I would start off with saying, well, look, you know, what would you want at the end of burned, buried, or frozen? And only one of them is going to give you the option of maybe coming back. And when they looked at it like that, and they'd say, well, okay, frozen. But then they'd have some other questions. I said, look, all other questions are irrelevant, because the first two things mean you're just not coming back. So take the first take that option of the cryonic preservation, and then you can ask questions when you come back, if you do. Another way that I found that if that didn't work, or some people had a different way of wanting to be convinced, was which I tied into Alcor, because Alcor, what I noticed in Alcor's website, they refer to the people that are there as patients and not as, you know, cadavers or dead bodies. And I like that, because what I would talk to people, I would say, well, look, if you knew that you or a loved one were dying and there was this last treatment, you know, for cancer, and it was you know, some kind of new treatment, and would you take it if you only had a few days to live? And they, of course, always, I didn't find anybody that said no. They always, oh yeah, I'll do it. And I said, well, what if that didn't work and there was one more option that could work, you know, and this option requires you know, nanobots are going to go inside the body and repair everything and essentially bring you back. We don't know if it'll work, but it's a chance. Would you take it? Well, everybody said yes. And I said, okay, well, the first step is we're going to cool your body down for several years. And then we're going to develop those nanobots. And, you know, everything has to do with marketing and how you present it. And as I was learning over that time period, it was working. And to your point about having credible people, that's important too. And last week when Natasha was on here, I mentioned about Larry King being in the hospital, and luckily I see that he came out. I just read in the newspapers, but I know he's a big proponent of cryonics. I'd mentioned to Natasha that, you know, hopefully you guys are in touch with him, and maybe he's got a policy signed up with you, because he's a respectable guy to an extent, and a lot of people, you know, find him where they like him. And if he was a guy who you know, signed, and I know he's been talking about cryonics since 2011. So if he was cryopreserved, that would be something that would, I think, draw a lot of good attention to cryonics, as opposed to maybe, you know, other celebrities like, you know, the debacle of Ted Williams, because there was debate about what his family wanted. I did see that you had an interview last year with Katie Sackhoff from Battlestar Galactica. She's an actress. Not everybody knows who she is, but what I loved about that interview was she went to Alcor, and she started off as a skeptic, or as if somebody who didn't really even know about it. And you proceeded to explain the whole thing and took her through a tour. And by the end of it, she was saying that she really considered it, and she's asking her fan base what they think she should do. And so I like that kind of approach. I think that's the kind of thing that that's the way it needs to be brought into mainstream. And I think there is going to be a tipping point. So when some of these more respectable or prominent stars that are well liked start to finally come on board, you're going to see a huge turn towards a lot of people wanting to do this. So I like that you're, you know, that's where you're going with it. And I hope that more celebrities of prominence will come on board. I had a question, and David mentioned you guys are both in Arizona. I know that People Unlimited is there. There was always a debate with whether or not they were signing up. Did you ever, have they signed up, or are they still on the fence with that?
I can't really answer that, Charlie, because if you ask any specific person has signed up, I have to say I can neither confirm nor deny that,
Okay.
which means that either they're not, or they are, but they're private. So I can't really answer specific ones. The same reason I can't say whether Larry King has made arrangements.
Right,
All I can say is that we've had, I don't know, two or three members of People Unlimited or ex-members who've joined Alcor, but I can't say there's been large numbers of them. I did see in a recent video, I think it was mentioned earlier on, that there's footage of them actually saying something positive about cryonics. So that's maybe a good sign. It seemed to be their view before that just thinking about this was giving in to death, which of course is completely the wrong way to see it. You're just you're taking rational precautions. It doesn't mean you're giving in to death, but I think that's kind of the way they were thinking about it. So hopefully they're changing the framing of that. See.
The other question I had for you, but I do think this is probably like the thymus experiment from Greg Fay. How's that going? Any news on that, or do you know any? Can you say anything about that, or no?
Well, it's probably, you know, like everything else, it's on hold probably for now because people can't travel around. But that's still going. As I understand it, they're planning another round of that with, you know, more people being eligible, I think, including women. I'm interested in doing a second round myself because they found in going over the results later on, they got, I'm going to forget the guy's name right now, the guy who did the aging clock, methylation aging clock. Steve Horvath. Yeah, they gave him the results and he did some studies and he found that people in that 2-year trial actually were a year or two younger at the end than they were at the beginning. They actually reversed the aging according to the best known aging clock. And that actually happened all in the last 3 months so it was a 1-year trial, the last 3 months of the 1 year. So I know that, you know, Greg is very interested in having people like me redo it and see, first of all, measure our aging clock and see how we maintain that gain. Has it gone back? And what if we do it for longer this time? What if we do it for 2 years where we get bigger gains in terms of the aging clock? So I'm very interested in doing that. There's apparently some funding from government now. Some people may be able to get their expenses covered, but there's also the pay-as-you-go option available too. So that's definitely still underway, but I think it's on hold probably for another few months.
Well, I'd love to do that myself. So I'll talk to Greg about that. One last question though. A couple of weeks back, we had Ashwin D. Wolf on, and he had talked about the fact that when they did scans of people that did a straight freeze, that the brain, the damage that a lot of people always point to, he said it wasn't as bad as most people thought. What do you think about that? Is that, you know, I know that obviously if you have an infusion of bio-grade protectants, it's going to be better. But he said that the damage that occurred from straight freezes wasn't as bad as most people think. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I actually did a video on that, which I'm sure you've seen, Charlie, where I debated Michio Kaku, the
Yes.
popular physicist, where he kind of did a very ignorant piece on cryonics, which is all wrong. One of the things he got wrong was repeating this something he obviously didn't bother to do the research, repeating the idea that if you lower the temperature that much, the ice inside the ice will freeze inside the cells, water will freeze inside the cells and expand and blow them to pieces. And really, he should have thought about that, because if that's true, how can we have frozen embryos and frozen skin and corneas and all these other things? That would not work. That's not actually what happens at all. What happens is that the cells will dehydrate and ice crystals will form between the cells. And yes, that will do some damage because those have pointy edges and they will poke holes in the membranes, but it's not going to blow them up. So it's going to be a bigger repair problem, which is why we try to avoid that and eliminate ice formation and instead vitrify the patients. But yeah, as Ashwin said, it's a lot less damage than people realize. We want to minimize that, certainly. We don't want to rely on the future to fix everything. But there's good reason to think that you're still there. It's just going to be a little more difficult to repair you. And I know Ashwin has a lot of studies of, with animals with cryopreserved tissue that didn't get cryoprotected. And as he says, there are reasons for optimism there.
Thank you.
Excellent responses. Thank you, Max. And now let's go to Art Ramon Garcia. Art Ramon, what are your closing remarks?
Yes, I have a question on any sort of recommendation for antiviral treatment for if you've gotten COVID-19, because they say that the virus can migrate into other parts of the body, and they say it's getting into the brain. So any idea of what would be a good antiviral treatment if you suspect you have the virus that's migrated into these other parts of the body?
Well, I don't think I'm really qualified to answer that question. I probably could throw out a couple of things, but I'd rather not do so without being more knowledgeable in the area. There was one thing I was reading about just recently that sounded very promising, but I'd have to dig it out of my notes. It seems like there are some treatments that have been largely sidelined. Obviously people like to make fun of things like hydroxyquinoline, even though it seems to actually maybe be effective in early stages. The thing is, it doesn't work in the later stages. That doesn't mean it's useless for everything. And of course, we found that some pretty standard stuff like, I think it's prednisone, basically, the easy version of it, can be extremely effective in keeping people off ventilators. They found administering that can really reduce the inflammation and reduce ventilators. You don't want to be on a ventilator. That's a really bad stage. But yeah, there is one other thing that I've seen recently that's quite promising, but maybe it's just as well I don't remember what it is, because I don't want people to try it out just based on my word.
Okay. And the reason I ask is because I believe I might be a COVID long hauler, and I'm concerned about possible brain injury from the COVID-19 virus. But thank you for your comments, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, both Art Ramon and Max. And now let's go to Pavel. Pavel, what are your closing remarks?
Well, first, Max, thank you so much for coming in. And considering that you were involved in the transhumanist movement since, pretty much beginning of its movement as we know it, I'm interested in your thoughts on transhumanist organization meta-level strategy. What should transhumanist organization like H+ or Transhumanist Party should do together in order to increase chances of achieving transhumanist goals?
Oh boy, that's kind of a tough one to answer briefly at all. Also, the trouble with answering that is it really depends, I think, on the nature of each organization. And there are so many transhumanist organizations or organizations that focus on a particular aspect of it that it's kind of hard to give general suggestions in that area. Generally, it's best for people to focus on what they're most enthusiastic about, to share mailing lists and to, I think, eventually have more events where people can kind of cross the aisle from people who focus on AI to life extension and other areas. That's why I think things like the Humanity Plus conferences could be very valuable. I think the Transhumanist Party might also serve that function. But it's really hard to give advice for all those different organizations. That you really need to focus mostly on what you enjoy doing most, what are you best at, because that's where your energy probably is best spent. But yeah, keeping in touch with other organizations, there might be a role, maybe H+ could spearhead that, of thinking about how we can coordinate different groups together to advance things. Maybe there are certain things that would be of benefit to lots of people, like certain regulatory changes, for instance, some of the things we discussed earlier on that are enabling conditions that would help us in each of our projects. So I don't really have anything brilliant to say on that because it's too much depends on what you're doing here and what you're doing there. And what kind, are you a research organization? Are you a networking? Are you political? You can't, for instance, in a non-profit that's not a political organization, you can't do lobbying. That would be illegal, for instance. So that would kind of limit what you can suggest for that kind of organization. So I'll try and write a better answer to that. I'm going to restart my blog after many years of it being cryopreserved. I'm going to rewarm it, and that might be a good question for me to address there.
Yes, indeed. And we look forward to your future thoughts on this. Conversations like this one, venues where we can have people from various different areas of expertise interact and share updates about their endeavors are important because this is what gives people the ability to, one, understand what is happening and essentially keep their finger on the pulse of the movement, and also then decide what they want to contribute toward, what they want to be more involved with. So hopefully we can keep growing the Virtual Enlightenment Salon venues through great conversations like this one. Now let's go to Jose Cordero. Jose, what would you like to say?
Well, I want to congratulate Max for his visionary ideas and all he has to go through in the last 40 years or more. And my question actually is about the future again, because I'm interested about the future, because we are going to be living in the future. And as you know, Max, I'm organizing the next Global Transhumanist Summit in Madrid after the pandemic. We hope that will be in June, July, but let's wait a little bit about the vaccinations. But my question is, besides the typical subjects of transhumanism, like longevity, nanotechnology, cryonics, artificial intelligence, robotics, space travel, what area do you think we should cover that is very new or very important to the future? Which topics?
Well, I can take that not as a question about specific technologies, but really about the focus. I'd really go back to what we talked about earlier, which is really not just intelligence augmentation, but wisdom augmentation, which is really a combination of the intellectual enhancements and the emotional enhancements and all the social aspects too. If we don't get that right, then a lot of this stuff is not going to either happen or it's not going to happen very well. So we covered quite a lot of territory in that, but I think more focus on what kind of individual methods and group methods for optimizing our thinking and decision making that would apply actually to the whole world, right? But especially to our transhumanist efforts. So I think that's more important than any specific technology, so to speak. AI might help with that, and other things might help with that, but that's a pretty critical thing for our future. And by the way, I don't live in the future. Unfortunately, I keep trying to live in the future, but every time I get there, it's suddenly the present. It's really frustrating.
Yes, indeed. It is 2021 already. It is 20 years later than the setting of Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey. We do have better video conferencing capabilities than they did, though. I will give the present that, though I wish we had settled other worlds by now. Now let's go to Arin Vahanian, our vice chairman, for his concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Max, for attending today and for everything you've done over the years. You're an inspiration to all of us here, I would say. I think one thing it's important to keep in mind is if we want to further the goals of transhumanism, cryonics, longevity, all these things we're passionate about, improving the human condition, we need to come forward. We need every available man and woman involved in our goals, and we need to bring forward data and facts with no apology, and be ready to proclaim our convictions in front of the rest of the world. I think that's really important.
Yeah, one thing that I think this probably exists in some form, maybe fragmentary, but what would be kind of useful, and I think about this specifically for cryonics too, would be, and we talked about how the different organizations might work together. Each group might actually contribute to this. Is kind of a set of cheat sheets for transhumanists of all kinds, because we always get certain questions, right? And some of us have thought really hard about how to answer them best. It'd be kind of nice if there's like a deck of answers that people could crowdsource basically, and have that available when you are trying to talk to people and be persuasive. So that might be something.
I'm working on that. I'm working on that. Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, great minds think alike on these kinds of ideas, and I'm glad to hear that. Now let's go to Dan Elton, our Director of Scholarship. Dan, what are your concluding thoughts?
Well, yeah, thanks for joining us and answering all these different questions. I think a theme that was touched on, which is really important, is education. Like we're always asking, why aren't there more transhumanists? Why aren't there more cryonicists? And I think what we're finding out is it's really comes down to education. And so I'm very excited that Humanity Plus is launching the H Plus Academy. So I wanted to pitch that event here. So Max Moore will be debating or in a dialogue with Susan Schneider. Let's see, January 17th, I think.
Yeah, a week. Yeah.
Yep. And so I encourage people to look up that event. It's going to be all virtual, of course. And so I think basically I think you guys are going to be talking about brain-computer interfaces, so which is a really hot topic. And so I'm really excited for that. But I think generally speaking, that education is an area the USDP really needs to get into as well. And I hope there can be a lot of collaboration between the USDP and Humanity Plus. Just spreading all these different ideas that we talked about, fractionary principle, cryonics, all of these ideas. They just need to be. We just need to educate people.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I was saying earlier, just talk to people, who you meet every day. I know Charlie doesn't have any trouble doing that, but some people may be more shy than Charlie. If you just blatantly unapologetic about these ideas, people will actually see that and they'll often be willing to have a conversation. But if you do it kind of hesitantly, like, you'll probably think I'm crazy, but don't do that.
Yes,
Just
indeed.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to put it all out and or engage with people at least.
Well, one of the things
I'm here, I'm transhumanist, you better get used to it.
One of the things I found as a way to convince people sometimes, because they did push back a little sometimes about, they had that weird feeling of arrogance that they would say, well, living long, why would I live longer, blah, 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 that's not right. And you're taking up space or something about overpopulation. But then if I turned it and said, wait a minute, what if it's your child or your grandfather, somebody you love, if it's not them? Well, then the answer was a lot different. Then they're like, well, yeah, I would try it for my little kid, So everything is so nuanced, but it's important, like I said earlier about marketing. But anyway, yeah, I look forward to January 17th as well. That'll be a great discussion.
Yes, January 17th will be a great day for education about transhumanism, because at 9 a.m. Pacific time, there will be the H Plus Academy event. And then at 1 p.m. Pacific time, we'll have our next Virtual Enlightenment Salon with Michael Elliott, who is a seasteader, the CEO of Ventive Float House. So please make sure to join us for both of these events. Now, let's go to Alexandria Black. Alexandria, are you able to provide some closing remarks?
Thank you, Max, for showing up. I wanted to circle back around to a few things. One thing we keep coming back to is how important the right to try is, not only with Mom in her current state, but as it would really advance both science, cryonics, healthcare in general, if we could get this more mainstream. And I found it interesting that we were speaking of death as a gradient, but isn't life also, some people are just barely getting by and others are thriving. I mean, Gennadi's running all the time. I think he's thriving. What else? Oh, hyperbaric oxygen has also turned back the aging clock. There was a study done in Israel lately. And back to what Art was saying about COVID brain. Long COVID. I will get back with you, Art, about what stat I took to avoid COVID, and how I've been advised to take that low dose aspirin every day. And the fish oil will also help. The omega-3s will also help with the cognitive damage. And I'd recommend Hesperid and D3. That's just the basic COVID stack for dealing with long haul COVID. And I was also going to ask if you were familiar with the Rebel Wisdom community or the Game B community, because you were referring to wisdom earlier, and they may have some resources for you. And oh, one more thing. I just want to influence you and Natasha for writing for Omni magazine and influencing us all way back then.
Oh, thank you. You know, one thing I saw that hyperbaric oxygen study, by the way. I haven't really dug into it deep enough to see. It looked fairly impressive. That can be verified. But I think one thing that can be recommended for long COVID or for not getting COVID, because it's good for everything, is anything that can reduce levels of inflammation. There's a lot of different things you can do, you know, all the boring stuff like exercise and avoiding certain foods that could be inflammatory. I think what we've seen in the last couple of decades is that inflammation seems to be the root of an awful lot of problems. And if you can reduce that, then you're less likely to get on a ventilator, less likely to have long-term problems from COVID, and less likely to have all kinds of issues. So, you know, there's too much to go into there, but there are all kinds of things you can do, from fasting to not eating too many processed foods, to meditating, staying calm. There's a lot of things you can do. Inflammation can do good, but it's also a major problem in a lot of issues.
I've heard that there are some fungal roots to inflammation we should check out.
Somewhat, sorry?
Fungal roots, I think she said.
Oh, okay, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, I think, Alexandria, perhaps if you could share some links with us later on, that might be helpful for looking in greater detail about that. But I think we've come to the point now at our virtual Enlightenment Salon where it is time for closing remarks from our guests. So Max, how would you characterize this conversation, and are there any further directions in which you'd like to take it, or say anything that has not been said yet?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat things that I said. One thing I didn't maybe mention that I can't remember who it was now, one of the panelists kind of hinted in that area, is in trying to get more people interested in things like life extension and cryopreservation in particular, and maybe some other things, is to emphasize, well, one person said, you know, emphasize, if not for you, how about for someone you love? That's a very good approach. But I think also emphasizing the positive economics of life extension. A lot of people just don't get that. They think, well, if you live longer, you're going to consume more resources and damage the planet and this and that and the other. What they don't seem to understand is we're not talking about extending the period of miserable, unhealthy life. We're talking about extending the healthy lifespan, enabling yourself to take care of yourself and not be a burden on others. And that's going to produce benefits for everybody, because, you know, if you can work and produce, even if you're not doing it full time, you're producing benefits for the world and enriching other people. So that's a very good benefit. Specifically about well, of course, it also saves a lot of money on hospital costs and healthcare costs. If you don't need to do that so much because you're very proof against these problems, it'll massively reduce cancer and heart disease and strokes and many other things, because those are age-related diseases. And if you tackle the root cause of aging, you're going to massively reduce all of those problems. I think you could also make an argument for cryonics. People often say, well, isn't that too expensive? Couldn't you give that money to the poor or something? Well, these people, of course, are quite happy to spend huge amounts of money on, you know, on cars and fancy houses. And as someone pointed out, they will absolutely take very expensive experimental therapies if they think they can help. But oddly, they have a double standard when it comes to cryonics. But in fact, if you look at the healthcare spending, certainly in this country, but I think it's generally true, in those last months of life, people use a huge amount of resources. And what if you could just say, you know, I want to go 3 months earlier than that, before things get too miserable, and instead, you know, save that money and use it for my cryopreservation. I'm not a big fan of having government pay for things, but I could even see an argument that that's something that you might get government assistance for, because you're saving money on the other end in the healthcare system, especially if, you know, if the healthcare system is run by taxpayer money. So there are some interesting arguments along those lines. Just overall, you know, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to have different perspectives and different questions, and to have kind of a nice roll through history and be reminded of what happened. And I'm kind of enthusiastic because I'm kind of shifting my responsibilities right now, and I'm looking forward to getting more involved in transhumanism again, and not so much specifically cryonics. I really want to get the proactionary principle going. I'm trying to get my website, you know, dug out of its grave and blasted back into life. I've got a whole bunch of topics I'm kind of passionate about writing about. So even though I'm, you know, approaching 57 now in a few days. I'm feeling kind of rejuvenated for my future in transhumanism. I look forward to working with you for centuries and millennia to come. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Max. And I would like to echo those wishes. I think so many of us would be thrilled to see your future writings, and especially in terms of advancing the pro-actionary principle. That is an idea that the world urgently needs today. Arin said in our internal chat, keep making magic, Max. And I would echo that as well. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. And until next time, live long and prosper.